Reality is not always probable or likely. We accept reality so readily, perhaps because we sense that nothing is real. These intriguing, seemingly false statements could only come from the mind of Jorge Luis Borges, Argentinian essayist, translator, poet and writer, best known for his short stories that he published from 1935 to 83, which is said by many to have helped found the genre of magical realism. Rather than dealing with mystical powers and epic heroes in vast legends like those of J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, Borges' stories occupy only a couple of pages on average, and usually depict the fantastical within the everyday, presented in a philosophical, scholarly manner. What's even more unique to his writing is the nature of fantasy that he explores. Not only do his subjects not exist, unlike many other fantasy concepts, they can't exist. We'll call this unreality, something which deliberately goes against physical possibility, let alone existence. Books with infinite pages, a disc with only one side, a perfect sphere containing everything in the known universe. What we see in his stories is a rejection of scientific, logical and perceivable reality in favour of the deliberately paradoxical and conceited, which is both fascinating and completely terrifying to imagine. One of the key principles of magical realism is the embedding of this unreality in the recognisable. Many of Borges' stories are presented as transcripts or translations of ancient foreign documents that he has supposedly discovered, and in many, the narrator is a fictionalised version of Borges himself, recalling personal memories or academic encounters, all of which provide a believable ground for the following strangeness. For example, in Tlun Ukbaran Orbis Tertius, Borges is drawn into a mind-bending revelation of an entirely new planet and linguistic convention through a wild goose chase for missing encyclopedia entries and letters, having been intrigued to investigate the origin of a quote on the significance of mirrors from a heretic of the country of Ukbar, of which he could find no record apart from in a single volume of an obscure encyclopedia. The form of a fictitious document that the narrator provides a commentary for is one that emerged around the latter half of the 18th century, with the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy and Sartor Resartus both purporting to be commentaries on fictional biographies and works. This style not only makes the fictional elements of the story more believable, but it also firmly associates the following unreality with the medium of literature itself. As Borges says, verse in drama does not allow its spectators to forget unreality, which is a condition of art. Borges was interested in the concept of metaphor as a literary conceit that links two things together through language. He argued that all nouns, all of language, are actually metaphoric, inaccurate representations of things, and that what we readily call metaphors are just more obvious than those whose inaccuracies we've chosen to forget.
Then we have the word king. King was originally König, and this meant a man who stood for the people. So etymologically, king, kinsman, and gentleman are the same word. And yet, if I say the king sat in his counting house, counting out his money, we don't think of the word king as being a metaphor. If we go in for abstract thinking, we have to forget that words were metaphors.
In Funes the Memorious, a story exploring memory, the titular character, unable to forget anything following a head injury, loses the capacity for thought because he can't generalise what he perceives to the point that one word no longer accurately describes something for him. To think is to forget differences, generalise, make abstractions. In the teeming world of Funes, there are only details, almost immediate in their presence. Once you've got past the wealth of biographical details, literary references, academic formatting, and the language itself, you find yourself in a completely different universe of mathematical, physical, and metaphysical impossibilities. The images he conjures up are hard to comprehend, sustained only by the words on the page and in your head. How the hell do you picture an object with only one side? Borges explained that in these types of stories, he was attempting to combine a plain style with an impossible argument, which produces the effect of something which is simultaneously accessible and completely senseless. The best comparison I can think of is with MC Escher, who produced artwork of impossible spaces, Mobius strips and intertwined objects that make sense while you're looking at the small details, where one staircase leads to another and so on, but which completely fall apart mentally when you try and apply real-world logic and an understanding of physics to them. Geometry and architecture are usually central to Borges' literary conceits. In the Library of Babel, he goes into great detail to describe the exact proportion of the hexagonal chambers that comprise the titular library, which is, for all intents and purposes, infinite, containing every possible book written within the confines of 410 pages. There's no explanation as to how such a place could have come into being, because in describing it, Borges has ensured its creation in our minds anyway. It's here that we stray into a rather niche branch of ontology, pioneered by Austrian philosopher Alexius Meinong, the study of the imaginary and unreal. Meinong argued that rather than there being things that either exist or don't exist, there are in fact three levels of so-called existence. If something can be thought of, no matter if it's impossible or not, it absists. Within absistence, you can apply some kind of logic as if it did exist. For example, you'd say unicorns have a horn, despite the fact that neither the unicorn nor its horn are real. Then, above absistence, you have subsistence, where something doesn't physically exist, but can be applied to the real world with a coherent logic. For example, numbers subsist, because although they aren't physical things, we can use them effectively as if they were, applying their logic to our own world. Therefore, existence is when something can absist, subsist, and be physically present in the real world. A lot of what Borges writes about is absistent, having no place or function in our universe, and the stories often read like elaborate thought experiments, where he and the reader attempt to apply logic. Because fiction is by definition not real, Borges' use of absistent ideas is just an extension of this. The conclusion usually arrived at in his stories is that what's being described is not just impossible, but impossible to think about. With most fantasy concepts, like goblins or dragons or talking lions, we know that they don't exist in our world, but they at least take the form of a creature which could have existed if evolution went a different route. The concepts imagined by Borges not only don't exist, but even thinking about them or trying to express them in any detail is an impossible task. The Aleph, probably his most famous story, sums this up the best. Here begins my despair as a writer. All language is a set of symbols whose use among its speakers assumes a shared past. How, then, can I translate into words the limitless Aleph, which my floundering mind can scarcely encompass? The Aleph itself, the point of space where all points converge, is infinity packed into a finite space. Trying to imagine infinity is hard enough, let alone when it's packed into a sphere a little over an inch in diameter. Not only did Borges explore infinity in space, one of the most remarkable ideas he developed was that of infinite timelines, years before the many worlds interpretation was proposed. In the Garden of Forking Paths, the Chinese professor pays a visit to a man in possession of a manuscript written by his ancestor, a heretical writer who was supposedly in the process of creating both a labyrinth and a book before he was murdered. A note made shortly before his death mentions his Garden of Forking Paths, believed to be in reference to the labyrinth he was designing. But as it turns out, the book and the maze were one and the same thing, with the forking paths not existing in space, but in time, representing all the possible outcomes of an ancient battle described in the book. This revelation makes the narrator feel a swarming sensation, as if the house was infinitely saturated with invisible persons, causing him and us to consider just how unique and objective our reality is, or whether we're living in just one of innumerable others. Infinity, whether it be in time or space, is a mind-boggling and terrifying concept in Borges' stories. Within the space of a few pages, we're forced to confront things beyond the laws of physics and the bounds of time and space, with the knowledge that we will never be able to fully get our heads around them. Like the librarian from the Library of Babel, despite attempts to quantify infinity and find the elusive crimson hexagon at the centre, which supposedly contains the meaning of life, we emerge none the wiser. There is a concept which corrupts and upsets all others. I refer not to evil, whose limited realm is that of ethics. I refer to the infinite. It's fitting and pretty ironic that after many of these stories were written, Borges became blind, and therefore, in some ways, was stranded in a world of potentially infinite possibilities, which he was unable to perceive. The true genius of Borges is the way he ends his stories, undermining the vast, incomprehensible ideas that occupy them. The final lines are often blunt, biographical facts, detailing the deaths of the extraordinary characters to ensure that neither they nor their impossible qualities can exist any further. For example, the protagonist of the God script, trapped in an isolated cell facing a jaguar, having realised that the secret to gaining godlike abilities and therefore freedom lies in the utterance of 14 words imprinted within the spots of the animal, remains stranded, unable to claim his reward, because in the many years he's been there, attempting to figure out this secret, he's forgotten who he is. Funes, the man with an infinite memory, died in 1889 of congestion to the lungs. The one-sided disc, the prized possession of an ancient king, is lost to the world when it is dropped face down. Even the Garden of Forking Paths, the Book of Many Worlds, is ultimately meaningless to the story it's in, as the professor kills the man in possession of the book, named Albert, in order to alert German High Command to an oncoming attack on the town of Albert. The impossibilities and unrealities of his stories are always defeated by reality and practicality. What difference does knowing about parallel universes make when we're trapped in our single reality? Stories are, in the end, only stories, and there's nothing more humbling than to be reminded of that as a reader. It also allows Borges to play with these lofty ideas without coming across as pretentious, as he acknowledges the impractical and theoretical nature of his conceits before we can pick up on it. There's room for philosophical speculation, and who's to say that you can simply rule out a lot of what we call impossible, but in the end, we're limited in our experience by our mortality and the laws that govern the universe, just as readers, we're limited by an alphabet and page numbers. What he's able to accomplish within these limitations, though, is pretty amazing.